Welcome to episode 2 of Move with the Sky, a podcast about astrology. And in today's episode, we're going to learn what a horoscope really is and about something called Z codes. Astrology didn't begin as a personality test. It didn't begin as a prediction machine either, and it definitely didn't begin as something you were meant to believe in. In fact, astrology began as a way of watching time. And in this episode of Move with the Sky, that's what we're coming back to. Not belief per se or fate, not signs as labels of your personality, but the original meaning of what the horoscope meant, what it measured, what it preserved, and why it mattered long before anyone asked whether astrology quote-unquote worked. So to understand that, we need to widen our sense of scale, not just spatially, but historically. In A Scheme of Heaven, a book written by Alexander Boxer, it opens a door that most modern astrology conversations never really approach. He takes us back to a world where astronomy, astrology, geography, mathematics, medicine, and even civic planning were not separate disciplines. They were one language, one system of observation. And one of the earliest figures to formalize that system was Claudius Ptolemy. In Chapter 5 of A Scheme of Heaven, Boxer discusses what he calls Ptolemy's astrological travel guide, a way of understanding how the sky was used back then to measure not only time, but distance, place, and cultural orientation. Ptolemy lived in Alexandria, Egypt during the Roman Empire, and his work pulled together Babylonian observations, Greek geometry, and Egyptian calendrical precision into something astonishingly durable. To understand how durable, let's anchor ourselves in a moment. Around 1 p.m. on August 24th in the year 79 CE, Common Era, Mount Vesuvius erupted. By the next day, Pompeii laid in ruins, and this eruption wasn't just a geological event, it became a historical timestamp, frozen in ash. And what archaeologists later found there complicates the idea that ancient civilizations were isolated or unsophisticated. Why? They found Chinese silk. They found a statue of the Hindu goddess Lakshmi, which means the ships of the ancient world weren't just moving goods, they were moving culture, religion, and cosmology. The world was already global, long before we had a word for it. And astrology grew in that world. At the heart of Ptolemy's worldview was a geocentric cosmos, an earth-centered universe, outlined in his astronomical masterpiece, The Almagest. That model remained dominant for nearly 1,500 years. That was until Copernicus and Kepler replaced it with a heliocentric system. But Ptolemy's influence didn't stop at astronomy. He combined astronomy, astrology, and geography into a single method of knowing where you were in space, in time, and in relation to everything else. In his work Geography, Ptolemy attempted something radical: to catalog the latitude and longitude of nearly 8,000 locations across the known world. His reasoning was elegant. If you record the time of the same celestial event at two different places on the world globe or map, the difference in that time reveals the distance between them. Time became a measuring stick for space. And the problem he faced, how to map a sphere onto a flat surface, is still one we haven't solved without compromise today. Every map distorts something, and Ptolemy knew this way back then. So he began experimenting. In a separate work called the Planisphere, which survives today only in Arabic translation, he described a mapping technique called stereographic projection. This method preserves circles as circles when projecting them from a sphere onto a plane. In other words, taking a point from somewhere on the globe and adding it to a map or something flat. Why did this matter? Because the celestial coordinate systems of astronomy, right ascension, declination, ecliptic longitude, and latitudes, they're all based on circles. So stereographic projection made it possible to display the entire sky coherently on a flat instrument. That instrument was the astrolabe. The astrolabe didn't predict the future, it told time. It showed you when stars would rise and set. It oriented you within the sky's daily rotation, and it became the visual ancestor of what Boxer calls the schemes of heaven, which are the circular charts we still use today. If you wanted to know where the planets were, you didn't guess, you calculated. You marked their positions on the ecliptic, rotated the map to stimulate the sky's motion, and suddenly time became visible. This is why astronomy and astrology were inseparable disciplines for so long. To access the influence of the planets, you first had to know where they were. Even today, we rely on tools like NASA's JPL Horizons Ephemeris system, used by the US Naval Observatory and the UK Hydrographic Office to generate astronomical data. The math hasn't changed, only the interface we use today has. So this raises a question that Boxer returns to again and again in his book. Did astronomy influence astrology, or did astrology motivate astronomy? For centuries, astrology was required reading for physicians. Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos wasn't just an astrological text. It was part of the medical curriculum, which meant diagnoses and prescriptions were timed according to the planetary cycles back then. Astrology wasn't mystical, it was contextual. And in ancient times, there wasn't even a clear distinction between an astronomer and an astrologer. The same word covered both. Astrology was also used in two primary ways. First, general astrology, consisting of weather, agriculture, cities, and empires predictions. And then the second was genotheology, which was based on individuals' destinies based on the time of their birth, from which we get the modern word birthday, which is actually derived from the Greek. So those two strands were revived during the Renaissance period, but their roots are far older. And before we go deeper into aspects, which we'll cover in episode 3, we really need to understand the geometric logic that lies underneath them. The zodiac is arranged into a fixed sequence of 12 signs along the ecliptic. Because of that structure, any two planets in the sky form a geometric relationship with one another, what we later called aspects. Originally, there were 5 aspects: conjunctions, oppositions, trines, squares, and sextiles. These weren't symbolic inventions, they were visible angles. So two planets in the same sign created a conjunction, meaning unity or harmony. 2 signs apart formed a sextile, meaning opportunity. 3 signs apart formed a square, signaling friction. 4 signs apart formed a trine, another meaning associated with harmony. And 6 signs apart formed an opposition, polarity. Now these shapes created elemental patterns, triangles of fire, earth, air, and water, known as triplicities. And those triplicities weren't just symbolic either, they were geographic. Now this brings us to astrogeography. Ancient astrologers believed that spatial relationships in the sky corresponded to spatial patterns on Earth. Babylonian astrologers associated eclipses with directions, north, south, east, and west, and rival kingdoms. Now Manilius and Astronomica assigned zodiac signs to nations. Ptolemy took this even further in his work Tetrabiblos. He divided the inhabited world into 4 quadrants using 2 anchoring lines. A latitude line, meaning going horizontal around 36 degrees north, passing through the pillars of Hercules and the Gulf of Issus. And a longitude line around 36 degrees east, passing through the Red Sea, the Black Sea, and the Sea of Azov. Now, at their intersection laid the city of Antioch, near modern-day Aleppo, which was the Roman capital of Syria. Now, I'm pretty sure modern-day Aleppo is in Iraq or Iran. Correct me if I'm wrong, though. Okay. Now, Ptolemy then described 73 regions, each with cultural characteristics tied to elemental triplicities that we talked about before, so fire, earth, air, water. Now, this wasn't race-based theory. It was geography-based ethnology, an early attempt to correlate environment, culture, and celestial pattern. He even proposed a controversial theory known today as astrosexuality, suggesting attitudes towards sexuality varied along geographic gradients aligned with those elemental quadrants. So, modern researchers compared this idea to the data from the 2017 Spartacus International Gay Travel Index using linear regression to test correlation. While correlation does not equal causation, the results showed a statistical pattern eerily similar to Ptolemy's ancient model. Again, this isn't proof, but we can recognize a pattern. Astrology at its root was observational, and now we arrive at the heart of this episode. What is a horoscope? The word comes from the Greek word hora, a specific moment, not to be confused with what we learned in episode 1, the word chronos, which refers to a specific duration or interval of time. Now, horoscopos literally means watcher of the hour. So a horoscope is not a prediction, it's a recorded moment of time. So one of the biggest mistakes people make when they begin learning astrology, especially modern astrology, is trying to stack information before they learn and understand the true orientation behind astrology back in ancient times. So people often want to know their sign, their chart, those aspects in their chart, their transits, what's going on right now in, their life, and then compatibility. Those are the most common things that people get into astrology for. But they don't yet understand at that moment when they're getting into astrology that it was designed to measure something completely different. So let's pause here and sit with this idea. Astrology was not invented to describe people. It was invented to describe moments. And people were understood inside those moments. That distinction matters more than anything else you'll learn. When ancient astrologers talked about destiny, they weren't talking about personality traits or psychological labels. They were talking about timing, context, and environment, about what kinds of forces were active when something began: birth, a journey, a coronation, a war, marriage, a harvest, or maybe an eclipse. These were moments worth watching to them. And that's why the word horoscope doesn't mean prediction. It doesn't mean forecast either. It doesn't even mean chart originally. It means moment watcher. So when someone asks, "What's my horoscope?" the more accurate question is actually, what was the sky doing at the exact moment my life entered this timeline? And once you understand that, astrology stops being so mystical and starts seeming a bit more architectural. So why does the ascendant matter more than you think? Earlier in the episode, we talked about how they were observing the planets. We now know that there are 8 data points needed to define an astrological moment: the 7 planetary positions plus the rising point of the ecliptic. That is the 8th point, meaning the ascendant is what turns astronomy into astrology. Because without location, time is abstract. So we need the ascendant. We need to know where it was rising on the horizon. Where were you on Earth in order to really answer these questions? So that means 2 people can be born on the same day under the same sun and moon with the same planetary lineup. But if they're in different places on Earth, they are born onto or into different skies. The ascendant localizes the cosmos. It answers the question, from where on Earth was this sky being observed? And that's why the ascendant changes roughly every 2 hours. That's why ancient astrologers cared about it so deeply. And that's why it's often called the horoscope itself. Modern astrology, before we go any further actually, let me try to slow us down. Because if you're into, or if you're new to astrology, or if you've been around it for years, there's a high chance that you've been taught pieces without ever being given the orientation like I mentioned before. Astrology isn't a list of traits. It's not a personality quiz written in cosmic language either. We really should be using it as a method of watching time. So let's jump back to those words we learned. The word horoscope comes from the word hora in Greek, meaning a season, an hour, a specific time, or a specific moment in time. Now, skopos means a watcher, an observer, or a lookout. So when we put those words together, horoscopos literally meant the watcher of the moment. Not the predictor of fate, not the judge of personality, just the watcher of time. So that distinction really does change everything. Now let's get deeper into this. When ancient astrologers like Phaetius Valens were casting horoscopes in Alexandria, Egypt back then, they weren't asking, who is this person? They were asking, what kind of moment did this life enter? And that's why Valens insisted that the 8 astronomical quantities were required to define a horoscope, not just one. Those 7 planetary positions of the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the 8th, which we just learned, the ascendant, which is the point of the ecliptic which was rising over the eastern horizon at that exact moment. Now, in ancient texts, that point was actually called the horoscope. It was the orienting marker. So, what else was going on in Alexandria, Egypt back then, and what non-negotiables in ancient astrology can we learn about in today's episode? So, this city is where astrology truly came of age. Alexandria, Egypt was not just a place, it was a crossroads. Greek geometry, Babylonian astronomy, Egyptian calendars, Roman administration all converged here. This is why figures like Claudius Ptolemy could write works like the Almagest on astronomy, Tetrabiblos on astrology, and Geographia on mapping the known world. To Ptolemy, these weren't separate disciplines, as we mentioned before, just one system. Was his idea on astrosexuality or astrogeography a bit flawed? Yes. Was it a bit biased? Absolutely. Was it symbolic mysticism, though? Not necessarily. It was early pattern-based geography, early data modeling, dated back thousands of years, that we still kind of use today. So, this is kind of where modern readers might get a little bit uncomfortable because, again, Ptolemy proposed theories about cultural attitudes, including sexuality, correlating them with those elemental quadrants. Now, later researchers like Alexander Boxer in his book A Scheme of Heaven compared those ancient models to modern data sets like the Spartacus Gay Travel Index of 2017. And it didn't necessarily prove astrology right, but it did prove something else. That astrology was not about belief. It was about correlation, observation, and pattern recognition. So to return back to that core question of this episode, what is a horoscope? It really is a snapshot of that orientation. It tells you where the planets were, where the sky was oriented, and how time was shaped in that moment. That's why sidereal time matters so much. Sidereal time measures Earth's rotation relative to the stars and not the sun. So relative to the constellations and not the sun. And the horoscope is essentially the ancient analog of sidereal time, the measurement of Earth's rotation relative to those stars. So there was one data point that communicated the orientation of the entire celestial sphere. Now that is genius. So when someone says, I don't believe in astrology because everyone with the same sun sign isn't the same, they're arguing against something astrology never claimed. Ancient astrologers never said that the sun alone defined you. They said that time defined you. And time, as we know, is multidimensional. That's why Valens insisted on the multiple planetary factors. That's why Mercury and Venus are constrained by their distance from the sun. That's why certain configurations are astronomically impossible. Astrology actually obeys physics, even when it interprets meaning. Now let's get into the second part of this episode. We learned what a horoscope is and was, but let's learn about something called Z-codes. The discussion of Z-codes in the book isn't meant to provide or prove astrology predicts fate. It's actually meant to show something more subtle, that moments are rare, that configurations repeat less often than we assume. Z-codes show us that the sky you were born under has occurred before, but far enough back in time that context changes everything. Astrology is not saying this will happen to you. It says this is the type of moment you've entered, and what you do with that moment, that's human. A Z-code is simply a way of compressing an astrological moment into a short sequence of symbols. Nothing mystical or interpretive, really, just structure. It's a shorthand record of those 8 components that we've already talked about. The zodiac sign of the sun all the way to Saturn, and then the zodiac sign that was rising on the eastern horizon, the ascendant. Now, how these are written, each sign is assigned a single alphanumeric character. For example, Virgo might be coded as 5, Aquarius as A, and Pisces as B. The letters are included just because it helps with the computation. When you put it into the computer, the coding system recognizes A and B better as numbers that are higher than 10. Once you get into double digits, it's a little bit more complicated for coding reasons. That's simply the reason why Aquarius and Pisces are as letters and not numbers. So, anyway, a full Z code might look something like a short string of numbers and letters, not because astrology was meant to be purely computational, but it just made counting and comparison possible. So Z codes are really just labels for those moments. Now, why does Boxer bring them up at all? He brings them up to argue meaning. He's using them really to examine frequency. How often do astrological moments actually repeat? If astrology were as simplistic as critics often assume it is, you're a Leo, so you're like this, then repetition would be constant, right? But once you start accounting for all 8 components, repetition actually becomes rare. And once you account for the astronomical constraints, like the fact that Mercury can never be more than one zodiac sign away from the sun on the ecliptic, Venus can never be more than 2 signs away from the sun. So the number of possible configurations begins to narrow in some ways, and then in other ways, it explodes. Now, this is where math really begins to matter. When Boxer runs the numbers, accounting for real astronomical limits, he finds that there are roughly 44 million possible Z codes that are physically allowed. That alone should challenge the idea that astrology is vague or repetitive. But here's where it gets more interesting. When he looks at actual history from 10,000 BCE to present day, he finds that only about 30 million distinct Z codes have ever occurred. And of those 30 million, over 42% of them have never repeated at all. Another 15% of them have only occurred once. That means more than half of all recorded astrological moments in human history, whether they're recording births, political events, etc., have been singular. They've happened once and never came back. And even the most frequently repeating Z codes appear only about 10 times across 12,000 years. That's not destiny. Again, that's rarity. Now let's bring this back to lived experience. This means that if we think about the facts, roughly 400,000 people are born every day. The fastest changing part of a Z code, the ascendant, cycles through all 12 signs once per day. That means that realistically, around 30,000 people worldwide may share the same 8-sign Z code on any given day. And this is where people often stop and say, "Ha, see? Astrology can't be personal if that's the case. 30,000 people, oh, whoa." But that assumes that astrology ever claimed to be a fingerprint, which it really didn't. Astrology doesn't say, you are the only one like this. It says, you've entered life during this type of moment. And those 33,000 people are not the same person as you because they don't share the same families, cultures, centuries, bodies, choices, or circumstances. What they share is timing. And timing is not destiny, but it is context. For example, someone who lived in the 60s experiences a completely different life than someone who lived in Babylonian times, even if their Z code is similar or exactly the same. So this is also where the classic twin objection begins to absolve. Even twins are not born at the exact same moment. The ascendant moves roughly 1 degree every 4 minutes. The moon advances constantly. So time doesn't pause just for symmetry. And Boxer even notes that within an 8-minute difference, the ascendant shifts enough to matter astronomically. So yes, twins share a sky, but not the same sky. And more importantly, even if they did, again, astrology never claimed that identical skies produce identical lives, only that they can produce comparable conditions. What is astrology actually claiming? This is the heart of the Z code argument. That it is describing the weather of time, not the path that you'll take through it. 2 people can walk through the same storm and come out changed in completely different ways. One may build shelter, another may run away. One could stay in the storm while another one leaves. Now, the sky isn't the thing that decided that. The sky just described the conditions. So, Z codes show us something deeply important. You are not cosmically special because the universe revolves around you. You're cosmically situated because you arrived at a rare moment in time. So, astrology is not meant to flatten individuality. It doesn't remove agency. Again, it explains the environment or the circumstance or the situation. And once you understand this, you start to really understand the language that astrology is written in. So again, when people say that astrology is too broad, too repetitive, or too vague, they're often responding to a modern caricature of something ancient and precise. Let me bring this home for you guys because future episodes will not be voiced like this. I will be teaching you the interpretive meanings behind it all, but it's definitely important to understand where it all started, okay? And pay homage to the people that have paved the way for us to use this in our everyday lives. This episode was not about teaching you how to read a chart yet. It was about teaching you what a chart actually is. A horoscope is not a personality profile, okay? So, in later episodes, we will talk about how those moments speak to one another through angle, geometry, and relationship. And hopefully, when you guys learn those things, you'll also learn when to plant, to act, or wait and observe a situation before doing or taking the next step. If you're skeptical right now, that's good. Keep that up and keep listening. And until I see you guys or hear you guys hear me in the next episode, move with the sky.